So welcome back. We have been journeying through the valleys of the seven valleys, and this week we are up at the final valley. The initial intimation that we had when we reached the Valley of Unity, which is really the midpoint of the seven valleys, but marks the beginning of a number of stages of unity. This initial intimation of the unity of all things in the middle of the journey, it produces at first a feeling of contentment, a feeling of at one-ment with the world, but it gives way to confusion, maybe even panic, wonderment, bewilderment, the sense of falling from a height at the apprehension of the abyss that lies ahead. And the entrance to this valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness, which is the seventh valley, is the plunging into an abyss from which there is no return, or at least not a return in the form in which one enters it. Let's begin first by reading some of the opening paragraphs of this valley from Baha'u'llah. This is page 45, paragraph 76. He says, after scaling the high summits of wonderment, the wayfarer cometh to the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. This station is that of dying to the self and living in God, of being poor in self and rich in the desired one. Poverty, as here referred to, signifieth being poor in that which pertaineth to the world of creation, and rich in that which belongeth to the realms of God. For when the true lover and devoted friend reacheth the presence of the beloved, the radiant beauty of the loved one and the fire of the lover's heart will kindle a blaze and burn away all veils and wrappings. Yea, all that he hath, from marrow to skin, will be set aflame, so that nothing will remain save the friend. When once shone forth the attributes of him who is the ancient king, all mentioned Moses burned away of every fleeting transient thing. Whoso hath attained the station is sanctified from all that pertaineth to the world. Wherefore, if those who have reached the ocean of his presence are found to possess none of the limited things of this perishable world, whether earthly riches or worldly opinions, it mattereth not. For that which is with his creatures is circumscribed by their own limitations, whereas that which is with God is sanctified therefrom. This utterance must be deeply pondered, that its purport may be clear. Verily, the righteous shall drink of a cup tempered at the camphor fountain. If the true meaning of camphor become known, our true intent will become evident. This station is that poverty of which it is said, poverty is my glory. And of inward and outward poverty there is many a stage and many a meaning, which I have not thought pertinent to mention here. Hence I have reserved these for another time, dependent on what God may desire and fate may seal. So Baha'u'llah is describing a state of the immolation of the lower self. Everything that he hath from marrow to skin will be set aflame, so that nothing will remain save the friend. In Attar's version of the Conference of the Birds, he has a wonderful parable to describe this state of being set aflame. And it's the analogy of the moth and the flame. And it encapsulates what for Sufis traditionally has been the three stages of certitude. There's, and we've discussed this in previous sessions, there's the certitude or knowledge that one has by learning about something, such as reading about it in a book, which is one level of certitude or knowledge. And then beyond that, there's the level of seeing it with one's own eyes. But there's a third stage beyond that, which is experiencing it, beyond mere seeing it, having the direct experience of it. And when it comes to something as potentially as destructive as flame, that third station of certitude can involve the destruction and burning up of of what one had before, of the self that one had before. This is how Attar describes it. Moths gathered in a fluttering throng one night to learn the truth about the candle's light. And they decided one of them should go to gather news of the elusive glow. One flew till the distance he discerned a palace window where a candle burned, and went no nearer. Back again he flew to tell the others what he thought he knew. The mentor of the moths dismissed his claim, remarking, "He knows nothing of the flame." A moth more eager than the one before set out and passed beyond the palace door. He hovered in the aura of the fire, a trembling blur of timorous desire, then headed back to say how far he'd been and how much he had undergone and seen. The mentor said, "You do not bear the signs of one who's fathomed how the candle shines." Another moth flew out. His dizzy flight turned to an ardent wooing of the light. He dipped and soared, and in his frenzied trance, both self and fire were mingled by his dance. The flame engulfed his wingtips, body, head. His being glowed a fierce, translucent red. And when the mentor saw that sudden blaze, the moth's form lost within the glowing rays, he said, he knows the truth we speak, that hidden truth of which we cannot speak. To go beyond all knowledge is to find that comprehension which eludes the mind, and you can never gain the longed-for goal until you first outsoar both flesh and soul. But should one part remain, a single hair will drag you back and plunge you in despair. No creature's self can be admitted here, where all identity must disappear. So the third moth doesn't return to tell the story of the flame. And I wonder if that's the case here as well in the Seven Valleys, that the seeker who passes through this valley doesn't return, but obviously someone remains, a person remains. It's that the one doesn't return in the same way. You know, the person who returns is not the person who set out on the journey. Just as in the hero's journey, the monomyth that we mentioned last time. Once you pass through the belly of the whale, once you've been through that experience of the darkest night, then the being that returns is not the same as the one who departed. And this raises, I think, or brings us to the question of why and how is it that this valley is so challenging for us to contemplate. Last week we mentioned some passages from the writings of Baha'u'llah that offers us stark reminders of the potential danger to oneself and to others in reaching the threshold of certain realizations about the world. And I feel personally that the challenge of the Seven Valleys, and particularly the seventh valley that we're in now, the real existential challenge of this seventh valley is that it forces us to ask the question, is our intuition, our very strongly held intuition, upon which we may very much base our faith about things in a very fundamental way, is our intuition about the stability and persistence of personal identity, at least the way we think about it, an illusion? Is the human soul, is the human consciousness, in the end, the elementary unit of reality in the spiritual world? Does it have that same sort of atomic existence, just like protons and electrons that have a very stable identity and can essentially last as long as the universe lasts? Now, there is something which is obviously stable. I mean, obviously our bodies are stable for a particular period of time. And the personality that is attached to those bodies, which is in some way a function of the experiences we've had, a function in some way of brain chemistry of things that we may not entirely understand scientifically, but are there as part of our DNA or part of the of the collection of experiences that we've had. All of that is obviously stable at some point and to a certain degree, but those elements are attached to the physical body, and it's hard to imagine how they could survive its disintegration. And that brings us to the question of, well, what is it then that survives? And it brings us to a certain tension that one finds in reading Baha'u'llah, not just Baha'u'llah's writings about this question, but throughout the religious literature about the nature of the afterlife, that one can find certain passages and statements which unequivocally say, yes, the soul survives the death of the body. Consciousness survives the death of the body. It's the nature of the afterlife is described in a certain amount of detail that leads one, or that can lead one to the very certain conclusion that, yes, the way we think about it, the way that we've traditionally thought about the afterlife, that's how it is. And we have the following very clear indications in religious scripture that is the case. But the problem and the tension is that one can, if one looks selectively, one can find another set of passages and writings which seem to indicate the opposite. So that the soul at some point is burned away, where Baha'u'llah says, everything that he hath from marrow to skin is set aflame until nothing remains but the friend. What space is there for our personality in that kind of, when seen through that kind of lens? And so there's a tension, and one way one can imagine, well, what are ways of resolving that tension? One possibility would be to say, well, there is a truth. The truth is either one or the other, and we're simply misreading. We're misreading the signs if we read it in one way or the other. It really is the case that personality survives the death of the body in just the way we think, and all of these writings about the disintegration and death and annihilation of the self are simply to be taken as some sort of metaphor. And really, the truth lies clearly with option A. Another possibility is that these two ways, and there may be more than two ways, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm boiling it down to these two positions. Another possibility is that they pertain to different states of understanding, these two ways of looking at human identity and persistence of human identity, and that both are correct in their own way. Even though it may seem paradoxical or even contradictory to say, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, they're both true simultaneously. But we find that's I think precisely what Baha'u'llah suggests. It suggests both in these mystical tablets, also what the Bab suggests when he talks about this resolution of contradictory positions about looking at certain fundamental properties of what we take to be the nature of the divine. The Bab deals with this in one of his, actually in his tablet, the five grades, the Panshan. He talks about how different people look at the nature of the primal will and representatives of the primal will, or the nature of the prophet, in two different ways. Some look at the prophet as the mirror of the divine, and others see the prophet as one who is solely in the station of a servant, as a creature. The Baha'u'llah also talks about this, by the way, in the Kitab-i-Iqan. But let's look at how the Bab describes the resolution of the tension between these two opposites. And this is in Nader Saidi's Gate of the Heart, page 175. He says, "The primal will, once it is manifested in this world, at the behest of God, speaketh of all things, and by virtue of its speaking thereof, all things are brought into existence. When he revealeth, I am verily the mirror of God. A mirror is created in which naught is seen save the countenance of God. Therefore he, a person, would gaze upon the Bayan and would always refer to these words, inasmuch as his inmost reality is verily created by this verse, I verily am the mirror of God. He therefore would consider those who fail to believe in those words to be of a lower spiritual station. And he is correct at his own level of existence. Likewise, when he revealeth, I am verily the first to bow down before God, there would be one whose inmost reality is created in the image of those words. Thus, he would adduce proofs from the Bayan in that manner, and gazeth upon him who is above him, as he himself doeth, on account of his inability to comprehend the higher station. For verily his inmost reality is generated beneath the station of the higher one. So the Bab is one can map this onto the seven valleys in that in the first paragraph is thinking about divine subjects from the perspective of unity, from the perspective of, all the prophets are mirrors of the reality of God, and so they all share a sort of inner oneness in relation to that. And people who see through that lens, it's almost as though one is naturally inclined to think through one lens or another. Some people are naturally inclined to think about things through this lens of oneness. And the Bab says that, and then naturally those who think about them in other ways, one imagines that they don't have it right, or they're in some lower spiritual station. And the Bab actually validates that. He says that's actually true within their own level of existence. But likewise, there can be others who see more through the valley of distinction. They see the prophets as those who are the first to bow down before God, those who are in the station of servitude as opposed to in the station of identity. And the Bab also validates that perspective. So Baha'u'llah does exactly the same thing in the Kitab-i-Iqan, in the Book of Certitude, where he talks about the twin stations and the manifestations, stations of unity and the station of distinction. And Baha'u'llah also doesn't say one of these is right and one of these is wrong. Each of them is right within their own point of view. And that doesn't lead us, however, in the direction of relativism per se. It's not to say that any perspective is equally correct, but it's more to say that there is a subset of perspectives which are correct. So it's a limited sort of relativity, maybe in the same sense, if I could bring it up as an analogy, in the sense that Einstein's theory of relativity is also not relativism. It's not saying that any way of describing the speed and velocity and time of events is just as good as any other. But at the same time, depending on the relative velocities of objects, there is a subset of ways that one can describe the physical state of a system. And it's a very limited subset, which is defined by certain strict symmetries of the system. It seems that a similar sort of case applies here in spiritual truths. There's certain symmetries underlying the structure of things, which leads to there being a subset of ways of perceiving which are equivalent in some way, which are all true within their own degree, within their own station. But that isn't to thrust us into a relativistic world in which anything goes and everything is equally true. So Abdu'l-Baha says something very similar in his commentary on the Hidden Treasure, which we mentioned a few weeks ago, and in the station of creation, where he's describing different views of creation. Abdu'l-Baha, and this is sort of jumping halfway into a long conversation on the question of whether the archetypes are uncreated or not. It's a very technical philosophical question, but Abdu'l-Baha comes to the same kind of conclusion, and he puts it in the following words. He says, certain mystics who have ascended to the heaven of inner meanings consider the archetypes, realities, and potentialities to be pre-existent and unfashioned. Others, who have quaffed from the crystal stream of knowledge and wisdom, consider the essential natures and realities to be fashioned and originated. This evanescent servant, Abdu'l-Baha, hath cited the statements and arguments of both parties in the fullest possible manner in this treatise. In his own view, however, all these statements, disquisitions, stations, and degrees are complete and faultless from their own perspective. For although that which is contemplated is but one, the perspectives and stations of the mystics differ. Each viewpoint, however, is complete and perfect with respect to the station and degree occupied by the viewer. So the Bob further explains that the reason for this difference in viewpoint has to do with the fact that each individual is a unique locus of a potentially infinite set of attributes. And it's that set of attributes that are most dominant within us that determine that lens through which we see, we see the world. And this brings us to what really is the mystery of consciousness itself, that it can be so different, that our consciousnesses of things, even though we all share this power in one way, and that's what unites us as human beings, is this common ability to perceive the universe in an elevated way. At the same time, the differences between us are one of the greatest challenges to the unity of the human race in the physical world. All things, we can imagine perhaps one way of looking at this mystery of consciousness and how it is that we can all possess consciousness, but it all is of such a different degree, is taking, I think, as our starting point, statements that Abdu'l-Baha has made in some of his talks about the nature of spirit, that spirit is found everywhere, that spirit is, and we can almost equate spirit and consciousness for our purposes, that spirit is found at all levels of existence. It's found in the level of the stones, as well as in the levels of vegetables and animals and people. It's something which is almost a universal power or potentiality which characterizes the universe. Everything possesses spirit, and that spirit is manifested in the world in different degrees of attraction, of the coming together of elements. It is very closely related to the idea of love, because the manifestation of spirit is the same as the manifestation of love at different degrees. At the very lowest degree, even, when we talk about what is the lowest manifestation of spirit or consciousness, it's the coming together of hydrogen atoms to form helium atoms. At the very simplest level, it's the love and attraction between elements that generates elements in a higher state of complexity, and those higher states of complexity ultimately unlock and allow even greater states of consciousness to emerge. Everything is in a state of motion in the physical world and in the biological world, and although one can look at the broadest sweep of physical processes, and mathematically speaking, everything is heading towards greater disorder, chaos. Entropy is the law of the universe at the largest scale, at the largest time scales. And there seems to be no way to avoid this gradual running down of things. At the same time, and not contradicting this, but in certain conditions, on the surfaces of certain planets, where the energy disequilibriums are particularly allow for the temporary existence of higher forms of states of organization. One finds the existence of higher and higher levels of consciousness, and the universe then is in a continual state of becoming from this elementary level all the way up to the planetary level. In the midst of growing chaos and entropy, there are forces of unity and love, which we can say are spiritual principles, but also have their physical correlates, and these forces are leading to the upbuilding of matter in kind of cyclical ways. It's almost as though that the universe is in a continual state of waking up, of becoming conscious, and ultimately of becoming self-conscious. And the ultimate process of things that can be described as the will to consciousness. and that will to consciousness uh, is is connected to an idea in the Baha'i writings uh, of what is called the primal will, which is the same as the logos of the Gospel of John. There is underlying everything a will to be known, um, which is the same as God's will to be loved. I mean, I'm trying to pull together threads from a lot of different places, and it may not be coming out entirely coherently at the moment. But the idea is that there is, if there is an underlying substance to things, that underlying substance of things is the will to consciousness. And that will to consciousness is what the Baha'i writings call the primal will. That primal will can be thought of as an ocean of which we are all the waves and forms of that ocean. And the waves of forms of the ocean of that will are continually lapping against the shores of reality. Individual waves come and go, but the ocean remains. And this happens at all levels. So you have individual cells coming into existence and out of existence, individual bodies, aggregations of bodies at the human level, tribes, nations, civilizations, planets, from the lowest to the highest, all are coming into and passing out of existence. And in doing so, they are making manifest this undergirding principle of consciousness and things becoming awake. And so there's and that's to get back to bring it back to the seven valleys. The same is true of our souls, that there's a cyclical process by which there is a necessarily almost a death and ruin of what came before something higher can emerge out of it. And that is, I think, the self-surrender and emptiness and annihilation of the seventh valley is an example of this death that has to precede life. The idea that self-surrender, the idea that emptiness and annihilation is a necessary stage in the spiritual journey, is an idea which is found throughout the religious, especially the mystical religious traditions of the world, both of whether of the East or of the West. And there's a massive literature on this, which I won't even attempt to touch upon in the very limited time that we have. But Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism in the East all have very clear ideas, and there's a literature of non-being, which is part of the spiritual journey, which is clearly enunciated there. It's less clearly enunciated in the Western tradition, unless you look at the mystical schools within the traditions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Within Islam, just to touch upon a particular tradition, which is important because it is repeated and taken up by both the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and it touches on this sort of idea of the darkness and untying of knots and undoing of things. There's a tradition in Islam called the tradition of Kumail, in which Kumail is one of Ali's chosen disciples. And Kumail asks Ali, what is the nature of reality? And Ali gives him a series of answers. And Baha'u'llah, in the Seven Valleys, or is it in the four, in his mystical works, refers to this tradition of Kumail. And this is how the tradition goes, and this is a translation by E.G. Brown. Thus, Kumail ibn Ziyad, one of Ali's chosen disciples, once demanded of his master, behind whom he was seated on a camel, "What is truth?" "What hast thou to do with the truth?" answered Ali. "For verily it is one of God's mysteries, and a jewel out of his treasure house." Then said Kumail, when Ali had spoken for some time after this fashion, "O my master, am I not worthy to share thy secret?" "Yes," answered Ali, "but the matter is a great one." "O my master," said Kumail, "dost thou desire those who beg at the door of thy bounty to be turned away?" "Nay, verily," answered Ali, "I will answer the call of such as are troubled, and will sprinkle upon thee somewhat of the overflowing fullness of the station of the truth. Receive it from me according to thy capacity, and conceal it from such as are unworthy to share it. O Kumail, the truth is the revelation of the splendors of divine majesty without a sign." "O my master," said Kumail, "I understand not thy meaning. Explain it to me further." "The effacement of the conjectured and the clearing of the known," continued Ali. "Explain more fully," demanded Kumail. "The rending of the veil by the triumph of the mystery," said Ali. "O my beloved master," rejoined Kumail, "tell me more." "The attraction of the divine unity through the nature of the apprehension of its oneness," added Ali. "Tell me more clearly," repeated Kumail. Then said Ali, "A light shining forth from the morning of eternity and irradiating the temples of unity." So the mystics of Islam have, particularly in the Shiite tradition, have taken this tradition as being one of the clearest expositions of the nature of ultimate reality, and have written many treatises on it. Among them, the Bab. The Bab has written a commentary on this tradition of Kumail, and one of the things that one of the things that the Bab has done in his commentary is he's interpreted it in a way that I think is relevant to this idea of the nature of things, and ultimately the nature of the soul being something which is quite beyond how we are traditionally given to understand it, which is that the soul is a, let's say, persistent fragment of the divine that has its own unique and stable identity. And the Bab, in his commentary on this tradition of Kumail, says the following about the nature of the soul. But he starts by talking about how God describes himself to his creatures. That there is, first of all, and to what I was trying to say before about consciousness, about the universe being can be thought of as a process of waking up, as this eternal process of consciousness coming to be aware of itself. Another way to put this in theological terms is one can look at all the processes of the universe as God wanting to be known. Something that is repeated in daily by Baha'is. That we're created to know and to love, or know and to worship God. That's the starting point of religion. Really, is the idea that we're created to come to this knowledge. Here's how the Bab describes it, and how he folds in the idea of the soul into it, and it's very challenging. He says, "Therefore it is necessary, according to true wisdom, that the pre-existent God describe himself to his creatures, that they may recognize their creator, and that out of the grace of the pre-existent, the contingent beings may attain their supreme end. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. It is unlike any other description, the sign of he is the one who hath no equal, and the truth of the servant, his true being. Whoso hath recognized it hath recognized his Lord. This description is denoted as the soul or self, and he who hath known himself hath known his Lord." At other times, so it bears rereading. So the Bab says the God needs to describe himself to himself. He says this divine self-description, which is another way of saying God's love for his own essence, to bring it back to Abdu'l-Baha in Paris Talk says there's 4 kinds of love, and the love that is responsible for all the other love is this love of God for his own essence. So it's this circling back on itself. It's the completion of the circle of existence, really. The Bab says this divine self-description, he says, is itself a created thing. And he goes on to say this description is denoted as the soul or self. And he hath known himself, hath known his Lord. Just in a sentence, he upends our whole universe in a way. He upends the whole idea that the soul that we think is our own unique possession is actually a mode of the divine self-remembrance. It's a very challenging idea. And he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. At other times, it is expressed as the heart, which is a description of the divinity by the divinity, and is the essence of servitude. It is the sign of God shown by him in the world and within the souls of men, that it may be revealed unto them that verily he is the truth. Behold with the eye of thy heart. Verily, thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he, capital, is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is. So what are we to do with this? If the soul, we think of the soul as part of a multiplicity. Every human being has a soul. So there's an infinite multiplicity of these souls in the universe. That's the way we think about it. And they all uniquely reflect God, like an infinite series of mirrors or something, but each of them a different shape or reflecting the light in a different color. The problem is if the mirror is the body and the body breaks, then what remains is not the mirror, but the light that was shining in the mirror. To move on into this a little bit further into the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'llah in paragraph 79 says, "This is the station wherein the multiplicity of all things perisheth in the wayfarer, and the divine countenance dawning above the horizon of eternity riseth out of the darkness, and the meaning of all on earth shall pass away, but the face of thy Lord is made manifest." So this passing away of the multiplicity of all things is this state of fana, the state of annihilation. It's instructive to look at how Baha'u'llah describes it elsewhere in his writings, because the idea of fana, the idea of annihilation, is pervasive throughout Baha'u'llah's writings. We first encountered it in the first session in our reading of the Rashi Amma, Baha'u'llah's poem that was revealed while he was in the Sialchal in Iran. And the very last verse of that Rashi Amma mentions fana in a very interesting way. And just as a reminder, the verse goes, "The vessel of the advent this, the clouds of limpid waters this, the trill of songbirds this, from our fleeting wellspring raining down." And we remember that in the Rashi Amma, every verse he was describing the raining down of something, of divine grace, which it was ambiguous in the poem whether it was raining down upon Baha'u'llah in the sense of he was a passive receptacle for the descent of something that fundamentally was outside him, or whether he himself was the source of that grace. And here it tilts towards the second of those. It was from our fleeting wellspring, all of this is raining down, and this fleeting wellspring is the Eine Fana. It's the wellspring of nothingness would be a more direct translation of fleeting wellspring. So the idea of fana appears in the very first work that Baha'u'llah reveals. And it's from this state of fana or nothingness that Baha'u'llah is speaking. But in the Seven Valleys, and it's worth mentioning, because in the traditional Sufi breakdown of the stages of the mystical quest, fana is followed by baqa. Annihilation is followed by eternal life. It's not the final. The state of annihilation of the soul is not where things end, but they end with a recovery of life after death. It's the completion of the hero's journey is only after the hero returns, after having passed through the belly of the whale and gone through that darkest of nights, and and been transformed and come back as a different person, there has to be a return. And this return but the return is on different terms. The return of the hero they're not the same as they were when they departed. And likewise, when one returns from the spiritual journey into the realm of Baga, of eternality, one is not the same as when one departed. The way Baha'u'llah describes it here in the Seven Valleys is Fana and Baga are described simultaneously. So when we first see it introduced in paragraph 76, he says, this station is that of dying to the self, the Fana to the nafs, and of living in God, Baga to Allah, of being poor and self-enriched in the desired one. So for Baha'u'llah, he describes the state of annihilation and the state of life as joined together. They happen in the same moment almost. And that's different from how it's presented in elsewhere in Baha'u'llah's mystical writings. In the Gems of Divine Mysteries, the valley of nothingness is followed by the valley of eternal life. And so they're presented as two separate valleys, whereas in the Seven Valleys they're presented identically. And one can see how this is the case, because this is not something that happens in time. These valleys are not things that necessarily happen in some sort of sequence where one can take out a stopwatch and sort of mark the time of entrance into one valley and departure from another, and so forth. These are states of consciousness which can actually all happen at the same time. As Baha'u'llah states later, it's possible to traverse all of these valleys in the blink of an eye. So going a little bit further into various statements of Baha'u'llah about Fana, about this multiplicity of everything's perishing, and the state of total self-surrender. In the Arabic hidden word number 7, Baha'u'llah says, O son of man, if thou lovest me, turn away from thyself, and if thou seekest my pleasure, regard not thine own, that thou mayest die in me, and I may eternally live in thee. And here the dying in me is Fana, and eternally living in thee is Baga. And a little bit later in the 14th Arabic hidden word, he says, O son of man, thou art my dominion, and my dominion perisheth not. Wherefore fearest thou thy perishing? Thou art my light, and my light shall never be extinguished. Why dost thou dread extinction? Thou art my glory, and my glory fadeth not. Thou art my robe, and my robe shall never be outworn. Abide then in thy love for me, that thou mayest find me in the realm of glory. I wonder if in these hidden words Baha'u'llah is giving us clues as to the nature of what that immortality, that stage of immortality is that follows annihilation. The immortality is immortality in God. It's not the immortality of the self that's already been burned away. The moth has dived into the flame and it's burned up. So what remains is the flame. What remains is God. It's the light of God shining within, which is the thing that's actually immortal. When Baha'u'llah here in the Arabic hidden word says, "Thou art my light, and my light shall never be extinguished," one could sort of read it with slightly different emphasis. Thou art my light, and my light shall never be extinguished. Having passed through that stage, the light shining within the soul becomes that light of immortality. Baha'u'llah describes in Gleanings 160, section 160, he gives us a definition of fana, which is helpful. He says, in this consisteth the complete surrender of one's will to the will of God. So this state of annihilation is a state of self-surrender, so that one's actions are one's own. One moves, one sees with the eye of God. One acts with one's hand becomes the hand of God. This is how it's often described in Baha'u'llah's writings. For example, in the Kitab-i-Igan, when he describes the state of the seeker having reached the city of certitude. He describes it in this way. He says, then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the Holy and Everlasting Spirit confer such new life upon the seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. So when he describes these further stages in the spiritual path, one is no longer seeing with one's own eye. One's now seeing with the eye of God, and one can imagine how that can be if one imagines the self as something which ultimately is ephemeral, like the reed and the pith of self, which is blown out of the reed, and only when that pith of self is blown out of the reed can the breath of the musician be blown into it and create the harmonies that were always there in potential for the reed to have, but those harmonies could not be heard while the pith of self was still within it. So let's move on a little bit further into the Seven Valleys and see what else Baha'u'llah has for us here. In paragraph 80, he says, "O my friend, listen with heart and soul to the songs of the Spirit, and treasure them as thine own eyes, for heavenly wisdoms, even as vernal showers, will not rain forever upon the earth of men's hearts. And though the grace of the All-Bounteous One is never ceasing and never stilled, yet to every time and era a portion is allotted and a bounty assigned, which is vouchsafed in a given measure. And no one thing is there, but with us are its storehouses, and we send it not down but in settled measure. Indeed, the clouds of the loved one's mercy rain down only on the garden of the Spirit, and bestow this bounty only in the season of spring. Other seasons have no share in this supernal grace, and barren lands hold no portion of this bounteous favor. O my brother, not every sea hath pearls, not every branch will flower, nor will the nightingale sing thereon. Then, ere the nightingale of the mystic paradise repair to the celestial garden, and the rays of the morn of inner meaning return to the day star of truth, make thou an effort, that happily in this dust heap of a mortal world thou mayest catch a fragrance from the everlasting rose garden, and live in the shadow of the inhabitants of this everlasting city. And when thou hast attained this highest plane in most exalted degree, then shalt thou gaze on the beloved and forget all else. The friend unveiled doth shed the splendor of his light through every door and wall, O ye endued with sight." Baha'u'llah seems to be promising us or warning us in these paragraphs that that the spiritual springtide is not permanent, that he himself won't be around forever.
I think that means he himself.
I'm imagining that that's what he's referring to, and that there's a spiritual springtime even for a given dispensation.
Oh yes.
And
then a season of harvest. Right?
And a season of harvest. And when one looks at Baha'u'llah's ministry also, this whole period, Baghdad period, has a special light associated with it. There's a special mystical force associated with it. All of his mystical writings really were revealed during this period. And afterwards, it's as though that particular springtide then gave way to the harvest season, and the harvest fruits of his ministry then were the laws and ordinances, when he moves more into the social domain of talking about how are we going to reorganize the world so that individuals can have these experiences. Because one can talk about the individual dimensions of the spiritual life, but if one is living in a world in which one is in a state of oppression, when one is in a state of fighting for survival in very basic ways, then one doesn't have the opportunity and the luxury of achieving these higher spiritual states. And so one can think of the motion of Baha'u'llah's ministry as initially laying out these spiritual gems of the mystic quest, but then he turns to the more practical or pragmatic aspects in later years. And so that springtime passed. And so he says, he invites his interlocutor to ask questions basically now while you have time, because it isn't going to, this time is not going to last. He goes on in paragraph 82 and says, "Thou hast given up the drop of life and drawn nigh into the ocean of the well-beloved. This is the goal thou didst seek. God grant thou mayest attain thereto." How does the individuality of the drop remain when it merges with the sea? This is one of those cases where there's this tension, because he seems to say clearly in other places that the soul, the consciousness, is a constant in the next world. There's a reunion with our loved ones. We're asked to recount what we've suffered in the cause of God. This whole imagery of the afterlife that we have is very much one in which the consciousness is a constant. But it's passages like this which make us wonder: is that all there is to it? If the drop is merging with the sea, then what remains of the drop? The water is still there. The water is the constant. Abdu'l-Baha says it in the following terms: "Release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out, and when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the..." Yes?
Could it be like the atom? We're all made up of atoms, but we have no idea where the atoms came from.
We don't.
At every stage, from the mineral to the human, the atom gives up its existence in that form.
Yes.
Totally, and takes on the attributes of the next.
That's one way to look at it, that the atoms are always there, but they give up, let's say, the identity that they were associated with as they pass from one form to the next. But there is a conservation at work. Just like there's a conservation of energy involved in the passage of matter from one form to another. There's a conservation of water involved when the drop merges with the sea. And so when we talk about things persisting, they persist at that level. But the individual drop, Abdu'l-Baha here say, let's read the rest of this. He says, "Release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out. And when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul. Until a being setteth his foot in the plane of sacrifice, he is bereft of every favor and grace. And this plane of sacrifice is the realm of dying to the self, that the radiance of the living God may then shine forth."
Could it be when everything goes back to its source, everything has a frequency or a wave,
Mm-hmm.
so you become one with that overall. That's what I got: moon and water and waves and frequency and suns and rays of light and intensity. So it all moves together as one,
Mm-hmm.
and there are different waves of like the ebb and tides, and different things rotate how hot or cool it gets, and that's the oneness of all becoming
Mm-hmm.
with the bigger things. But there's that emptiness. Maybe some people they think they experience only because they think they're alone and all that, because it's an individual journey.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
no matter what you look at, and things that are made up of something, they're always individual dots of the whole.
Yeah.
So that's what I get when every time you're mentioning something, is this vibration and this frequency, how it all comes together to create motion and movement and intensity and heat and all that.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's keep reading. In paragraph 83, he goes on and says, "In this city, even the veils of light are rent asunder and vanish away. His beauty hath no veiling save light, his countenance no covering save revelation. How strange that the beloved is as visible as the sun, and yet the heedless still hunt after tinsel and base metal. Yea, the intensity of his revelation hath veiled him, and the fullness of his shining forth hath hidden him. Even as the noontide sun hath the true one brightly shined, but alas that he hath come to the city of the blind." The openness of it is something which maybe if there is as Baha'u'llah so often talks about secrets and some of which may be dangerous, they're not hidden in the sense that they're not available for people to see, but they're openly there. The word itself is its own veil. The intensity of its shining is the thing which covers it. And so whatever Baha'u'llah has to say to us, it's said openly. It's a matter of are we reading it right? Because what he says to us can be read in different ways. There's 72 meanings to every verse, and sometimes oh, and each of these meanings is true in its own way. And that's the magic of it, is this multivalence, that everyone is going to read this and come away with their own thing. They'll be inspired in their own way to it. And who else can write in such terms? What other author is there that can write to multiple audiences at the same time? It's kind of a spectacular thing about that the limited receptacle of words can be so formed and so assembled and put together that you have layers and layers of meaning within a given set of words. In that sense, these words are their own. The intensity of them, the shining of them is its own veil. He goes on and refers to some of the ideas of the mystics, a particular idea of the mystics in paragraph 84. He says, "In this valley the wayfarer passeth beyond the stages of the unity of existence and the unity of appearance, and reacheth a unity that is sanctified above both of these stations. Ecstasy alone can encompass this theme, not utterance nor argument. And whosoever hath dwelt at this stage of the journey, or caught a breath from this garden, knoweth whereof we speak." The unity of existence here is vatate vujud, and unity of appearance is vatate shuhud. So people who have studied a little bit of Sufism will have encountered these two phrases. They're two of the central ideas in Sufism. Vatate vujud is commonly attributed to Ibn al-Arabi, one of the great mystics of Islam, wrote in Arabic, although he himself never actually uses the phrase. It's attributed to him. And what Baha'u'llah is here referring to is the difference between two schools of thought among the mystics. Those who believe that in the end it's all God, and which one might say is a form of pantheism in a way, that the divine reality is the inmost essences of things. And on the other hand, this vatate vujud, or vatate shuhud, or unity of appearances, which is more that everything is the appearance of the divine, not the essence of the divine. And Baha'u'llah, interestingly, doesn't say, well, these are both true in their own station. He does say that in a way, but here he says there's actually a third station which is beyond these two, which is not actually in the Seven Valleys. We have to wait for the next tablet to look into that, to where he actually transcends these two states. It's almost as though, because the Seven Valleys, as we talked about, is divided into the first three and the last four. There's the valleys of distinction, and then there's the stages of unity. And this Vatate Shuhud is more like the stages of distinction, and the Vatate Wujud are the stages of unity. And Baha'u'llah is alluding to there being at least one stage beyond even the idea of valleys of unity or valleys of distinction. So in all these journeys, he says, the wayfarer must stray not a hair's breadth from the law, for this is indeed the secret of the path and the fruit of the tree of truth. And in all these stages he must cling to the robe of obedience to all that hath been enjoined, and hold fast to the cord of shunning all that is forbidden, that he may partake of the cup of the law and be informed of the mysteries of truth. This is a very important paragraph because it directly addresses what was one of the, let's say, misconceptions of certain of the Sufis, which is the idea that once we reach a certain stage in the spiritual journey, we can do away with the laws. We're above all that. We understand what the point of them was, but we don't have to follow them. And so Baha'u'llah says that one must stray not a hair's breadth from the law, even when one reaches this stage. In paragraph 86, this is where he invites the seeker to ask questions. If any of the utterances of the servant be not understood or lead to perplexity, the same must be inquired of again, that no doubt may linger, and that the meaning may shine as resplendent as the face of the beloved dawning from his glorious station. These journeys, he goes on, have no visible ending in this temporal world, but the detached wayfarer, should invisible confirmation descend upon him, and the guardian of the cause assist him, may traverse these 7 stages in 7 steps, nay, rather in 7 breaths, nay, even in a single breath, should God will and desire it. This is a token of his grace, vouchsafed unto whomsoever he pleaseth. Some Baha'is read this Guardian of the Cause and thought it was referring to Shoghi Effendi, and Shoghi Effendi wrote back saying, no, it has nothing to do with me. But this idea of it being possible to traverse all of these valleys instantaneously is mentioned elsewhere in Baha'u'llah's writings. For example, in the 7th Persian hidden word, Baha'u'llah says, "Thou art but one step away from the glorious heights above. Take thou one pace, and with the next advance into the immortal realm." So we're always one step away, or one breath away. In Gleanings, or also Gleanings is quoting Katabi Gan. He says, "Swift as a twinkling of an eye, you may, sort of traverse all of these meads of the valleys of loss and bereavement, and attain to your goal." Also, in the introduction to this volume, where Baha'u'llah is describing the 7 valleys and putting it a bit in perspective, he says, "In this day," this is on page 11 in the introduction, Roman numeral 11. He says, "However, in this day, every soul who hath fixed his gaze upon the supreme horizon and hath recognized the one true God hath verily attained unto every one of the 7 valleys or 7 stations mentioned therein." So recognition is equivalent to the traversal of all of these journeys. In paragraph 88, he says, "They who soar in the heaven of divine unity and attain the depths of the sea of detachment reckon this city, which is the station of life in God." So here again, he's sort of merging Fana and Baqa, "as the loftiest state of the mystic knowers and the furthermost homeland of the faithful lovers. But to this evanescent one of the mystic ocean, this station is the first gate of the heart's citadel, that is, man's first entrance to the city of the heart. And the heart is endowed with 4 stages, which would be recounted should a kindred soul be found. Shattered was the pen at once, rent and torn in twain the page, when the pen did reach the point of depicting such a stage." A lot of people assumed that this 4 stages of the heart was the 4 valleys, because the 4 valleys originally came right after the 7 valleys in the publication. But that's actually not the case. Shoghi Effendi was asked this actually, and he said it wasn't the 4 valleys. Someone actually asked Abdu'l-Baha this question, and Abdu'l-Baha answered, and perhaps the answer raises more questions. But this was in June 11th, 1913, and so this is in Pilgrim's Note, or it's in the diary notes of Ahmad Sohrab, who was Abdu'l-Baha's secretary at the time. And so he recalls someone asking about this heart having 4 stages. And Abdu'l-Baha was recalled to have said, Baha'u'llah says, "When the soul hath traveled through many valleys, it reaches to the city of love. That city contains 4 pillars. Whenever I found a hearing ear, I shall explain what are those 4 pillars. During the life of Baha'u'llah, no one asked the explanation of this matter, but now you ask, and I will elucidate it for you. The first station is the station of divinity, uluhiyat. The second is, and we also have this in Persian, fortunately, the second is the station of the prophet or manifestation, mazhariyat. The third is the station of sanctification, and the fourth is the station of servitude, and that is ubudiyat. So that was, someone asked him in Paris. Was sanctification. This is from memory, and I think it was qudusiyat, but huh?
The translation of it in Arabic.
I recall it being qudusiyat, but it's my memory, and so that's why I didn't say it originally. But I remember seeing it, so this is the Persian is from memory. But I remember uluhiyat and mazhariyat. So Abdu'l-Baha answered what those 4 stages are. But it just raises more question, because what is he referring to? Is this a reference to are there existing definitions of these that we then need to dig into, or is he just referring to
only one pillar that we could possibly reach, and that's servitude?
Servitude, yes. Or is this kind of the ringstone symbol? I mean, there's uluhiyat, God, the manifestation, mazhariyat, and then there's two stages of the individual. The sanctified soul and the or let's say the soul existing in the state of oneness, and the soul existing in the state of differentiation.
Its pillars is holding up something else.
Yeah. So it's also interesting, he said the heart is endowed with 4 stages, but before that he said the station is the first gate of the heart's citadel. And the idea of the heart having, there being a gate of the heart is the whole topic of Nader Saidi's book on the writings of the Bab, Gate of the Heart. And the Bab wrote extensively about this, that it's only through the eye of the heart that one can see through the differences into the unity behind things. The Bab writes about it in Gate of the Heart, page 177. He says, "Beseech thou God to open through his grace the gate of the heart unto thee, inasmuch as without the light of that sanctuary man is unable to conceive of contrary attributes within one and the same thing." And also, "For intellect conceives not save limited things. Verily, bound by the realm of limitations, men are unable to gaze upon things simultaneously in their manifold aspects. Thus it is perplexing for them to comprehend that lofty station. No one can recognize the truth of the middle way between the two extreme poles, except after attaining unto the gate of the heart, and beholding the realities of the worlds visible and unseen." So the Seven Valleys concludes after this little mark between paragraphs 88 and 89 with one or two different postscripts, one could call them, where he addresses his interlocutor in other terms. And I won't finish reading this partly because I've run out of voice. But one of the questions apparently he was asked was the meaning of the word sparrow, and Baha'u'llah breaks it down into each of the individual letters and describes associates a quality of God with each of the letters and then describes what each of them is. Similarly to what the Bab did in many of his writings, he would take certain short surahs of the Quran and almost as a way to underline the point that the divine attributes are found at the atomic level. He shatters or explodes these shorter surahs into their individual components, not just the word level, but the letter of the level at the level of the letters, and then writes a commentary on each of the letters comprising each of the words of these shorter surahs. The Bab did this several times in the course of his writings, almost as though to just make a point about there being meanings concealed within at every level of being. And we have a little touch of that in the concluding paragraphs of the Seven Valleys. But I wanted to maybe finish with a few thoughts about the idea about maybe bringing it to the present. And we have a mystical treatise that's describing an individual reaching these elusive heights of spirituality, in which there's a vanishing of the self. How does that impact the issues of the world today? How is this going to solve the problems of the world? If we're thinking of the Seven Valleys not just as a mystical treatise, but as a textbook for the reconstitution of the world, in a way, as a way to transform human consciousness in a way that won't just benefit people individually, but will benefit the world in its social sphere. Then one question we might ask is it the case that the Seven Valleys is charting the journey of a spiritual seeker who reaches the end point and then sort of disappears, And then if you disappear from existence because you've vanished, then you're not much good in the world anymore. And Baha'u'llah in paragraph 73, he says, "Waste not the treasure of thy precious life occupied with the swiftly passing world." So we have statements in the Seven Valleys that seem to say, just detach from it, and disappear into this state of oneness with God. But Baha'u'llah at the same time elsewhere says, "Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day, of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." And so, where is the balance to be struck between being in the world and being a source of love and unity, and of working towards the advancement of the human race, being a part of this ever-advancing civilization, and being an intimate of the mysteries, of being a soul that has become evanescent, and through that evanescence, which actually, when you see the word evanescence in the Baha'i writings, it's always a translation of fana, and through this state of evanescence, being an even more powerful agent for change in the world. I'll let Abdu'l-Baha have perhaps the final word on this, and he says it so beautifully here. He says, "Soon will your swiftly passing days be over, and the fame and riches, the comforts, the joys provided by this rubbish heap the world will be gone without a trace. Summon then the people to God, and invite humanity to follow the example of the company on high. Be ye loving fathers to the orphan, and a refuge to the helpless, and a treasury for the poor, and a cure for the ailing. Be ye the helpers of every victim of oppression, the patrons of the disadvantaged. Think ye at all times of rendering some service to every member of the human race. Pay ye no heed to aversion and rejection, to disdain, hostility, and injustice. Act ye in the opposite way. Be ye sincerely kind, not in appearance only. Let each one of God's loved ones center his attention on this, to be the Lord's mercy to men, to be the Lord's grace. Let him do good to every person whose path he crosseth, and be of some benefit to him. Let him improve the character of each and all, and reorient the minds of men. In this way, the light of divine guidance will shine forth, and the blessings of God will cradle all mankind. For love is light, no matter in what abode it dwelleth, and hate is darkness, no matter where it may make its nest. O friends of God, that the hidden mystery may stand revealed, and the secret essence of all things may be disclosed, strive ye to banish that darkness forever and ever."